Alrighty, welcome back to another thrilling installment of Mecha Mondays at long last. Sorry about not being around last week. I had work that I could not avoid. So, previously on, we're finally seeing what did Felix in, apparently. Um, Holly, Jack Crow, and Laya are plugged in and are watching the final transcripts of what Felix experienced. And well, it hasn't been great. Nobody believes that he's sortied like 20 times. Um, no one believes it at all. No matter how many people he tells, the few people that kind of instinctively believe him are like, well, you're terrifying and probably bad luck, so it's not great. Um, but right now he's having a little bit of difficulty getting his engine running, um, which is bad because that's his primary uh, engine self. His engine self is his primary means of surviving and maintaining an emotional distance from the soul-destroying PTSD hellhole and just traumatic stress-inducing hellhole that is Banshee. Um, High Command doesn't seem to have figured out a fleet. Hasn't seemed to have figured out. There we go. That Banshee is a colossal waste of everyone's time to invade on foot. Uh, and uh, and some young bloods apparently formulated a plan by which they want to do a combination of research and testing. And one of the things they want to do is they want to build a bunker fortress on the surface of Banshee, the ant-infested, anathema to human life Banshee. They have done this. Great success. Um, their other thing that they want to do is they want to find out how many ants are in one of their outpost nest armory anthills. Not a big hive, but a small one, where they know that larvae are grown at speed in order to throw at whatever. Um, and so they've killed, I don't know, several thousand ants at this point. And they also want to see how long it takes, how many bodies it takes before they start degrading in quality, I think is the other thing they want to do. That's just about it. And yeah, so that's where they are right now. Oh yeah, and the face of the mobile infantry, not mobile infantry, armored infantry, uh, Kent, the guy that Forrest, way back at the beginning of the book, spoke so highly of, is here. Uh, we haven't really seen much of him. He's wearing a ultra high performance combat armor and is able to move very quickly. Um, this whole exercise is largely PR, while also having a side order of science um, with a bunch of young officers that are like, oh, hey, we can finally see combat. It's like, well, maybe that's not such a great idea. We'll find out how not such a great idea it is as we go. Things are going to get messy. Minor spoilers. I think everybody saw that coming, but it's not exactly going to go terribly well. So the last paragraph before we stopped previously was something along the lines of, After a while, he felt it start to happen. He felt himself dropping away, dropping back to nothing, to the nothing he had been and to the nothing he still needed to be. But he couldn't get all the way. He couldn't quite get back to where he wanted. He couldn't quite get back to the engine Felix. But he would, he told himself with bitter certainty. He would. He'd better. Now we resume. Felix slipped carefully through the center of the maze toward the ridge and the dorm beyond. Dorms, that's what they're calling them, little ant outposts. He had left the walls 10 minutes before with the rest of the scouts. "Find out what's what," a Major Eleke had told him. "We don't want any surprises." Felix had nodded, and, finding himself in loose command of the other 5 scouts, had simply lined them up at quarter-kilometer intervals and sent them off. He had ended up, by virtue of this system, with the center of the maze. He cursed at the effort involved. The others were surely far ahead of him by now. Railsmith, for instance, had the smooth edge of the killing runway, and "Help! Help! Oh shit!" sounded from somewhere. From someone. Was it Railsmith? That would make it to his left. "Help! Help! Blasters! Look out!" Felix controlled the command prime band. He keyed it and spoke, trying to sound controlled. "Who is this? Railsmith, is that you?" "Felix! Felix! Yes, it's me! Help!" Felix cut him off. "Where are you, damn it?" "At the dorm! I'm here with... Oh, shit! We're coming back!" "Well, do it then!" he snapped angrily. "Stupid jerk!" He paused a moment, considering. Railsmith was to the left. He'd probably come back down the edge of the runway, sidestepping the piles of dead ants. Felix headed for the killing area to cut him off. Other voices sounded alarms all up and down the lines. He interrupted their exclamations long enough to shout, "Scouts in!" Unnecessary, of course. From the sound of them, they had been retreating when it had happened. Cursing eloquently, he clambered over the last 3 walls of the maze onto the edge of the runway, just as Railsmith and another scout appeared over the ridge in panicked flight. The other scout, Giller, maybe, damned near died at Felix's abrupt appearance right in front of them. He dropped his rifle and skidded to a stop on his butt. "Pick that up," growled Felix. Then to Railsmith, "What is it, blasters?" Felix's calm appeared to offend Railsmith deeply. "Hell yes, blasters! They've all got 'em! Everywhere! Never seen so many!" Felix resisted pointing out that Railsmith had never seen any before. Instead, he tried getting something in the way of coherent details. But that's when the heat ray struck them. "Holy shit!" screamed Giller, jumping 3 meters straight up. "Come on, damn it!" Felix snarled, dragging them sideways into the cover of a gully. The 2 scouts started tearing down the length of it. "No, no! Shoot them! Like this!" Rifle in hand, he leaned around the edge of a dune and fired at the half-dozen ants coming down the runway. All, he noted grimly, carried blasters. "What's with you?" demanded Railsmith angrily. "You're so damn brave, are you?" Good point, Felix thought. Then, "So let's get the hell back to the fort." He stepped back onto the runway. More ants had appeared over the ridge, firing blasters. "This way," he waved. Railsmith stared. "They can shoot us that way! There's no cover! I'm going back through the maze!" Felix grabbed and held him. "Come on, you idiot! The blasters can't stop us in time. They aren't blazers, damn it! Besides," he added, indicating the maze with a gesture, "they'll catch up to us in this shit." Railsmith looked hesitant. Giller looked frozen. "Come on," Felix repeated, waving them forward again. "I'll cover." He stepped out around the dune once more and fired at the hurtling ants. The first 7 crashed instantly to the sand, piling up the others behind. He waved the other 2 scouts on. Run, damn it, while they can't shoot. The scouts obeyed at last, streaking past him onto the siliconite-packed runway. Felix provided another couple of seconds of covering fire. The ants were too jammed up onto themselves to require much more. So eager, he thought grimly. They want us too much to even look where they're going. Then he followed the other two, as fast as he could run. Felix wow. Okay. Felix sat on a stool atop the command platform, working the wand over the relief holo of the area between the bunker and the dorm. Where he touched the tip of the wand to the surface of the screen, a star would appear, symbolizing every place the scouts had reported contact with blaster-carrying ants. The brass standing over his shoulder as he worked moved quickly forward when he put down the wand. Somebody gasped when the full extent of the sightings was seen. "Well, hell," said somebody Felix hadn't met. "They've got every approach covered." "I didn't even know dorms carried blasters," said somebody else, a captain, looking accusingly at Felix. "They didn't tell me either," he replied dryly. Major Elike spoke up. "That's not the point. The point is, what are they trying to keep us from seeing? What are they hiding?" He looked around at the others. No one responded. Colonel Kudar was insistent. "Well, anybody got an idea? Felix?" Felix considered a moment. "Maybe nothing," he said at last. "They may just want to keep things tight while they bake reinforcements." "I still think we'd better have a look," said the major. He looked then, as did everyone else, toward the CO, Brigadier Hamad Renault. The old man was silent, as he had been since Felix's arrival. Felix found little hope in that. "What do you say, Felix?" insisted the major. "How about taking a look?" Felix met his gaze. "They don't like me," he replied carefully.
"Ah, come on, Felix!" barked Kudar heartily, slapping Felix's shoulder with gusto. "Those blasters are puny things. You know how they gotta focus on the same patch of armor before the plasteel goes."
Felix's voice was wooden. "How long?" he asked. Kudar hesitated briefly.
"Long time," he said at last. "Believe me, a long time."
"Perhaps if the colonel would demonstrate the first run," Felix suggested in the same wooden fashion. He missed the colonel's angry reply. He was watching the major instead, who had sidled up alongside the old man. The others turned to watch as well. After a few seconds of the armored version of whispering, the major got his response, a short, decisive nod. "All right, Major. All right, Felix," said the major. "Go." Felix stared at him. "Are you kidding?"
"Now, just a second there, Scout. Now, just a second there, Scout,"
began somebody. The major cut him off with a gesture. "Go, Felix. Right now. That's an order." Felix stood up. He sighed. "It would be," he said. Felix had decided to use the gap in the ridge they had used to flee the dorm that first time. He couldn't make the best sighting from there, he knew, but neither could he make the best target. He clambered over a wall, pausing before dropping to the gully on the other side. He looked back instead. The network of the maze sloped away from him. It looked like something rats should be running through, not people. Almost, he thought with a shudder, as if the ants had planned it that way. He dropped over the wall into the next gully. He examined the next crusted wall of sand, as always, higher than the last one. He sighed. He figured he had no more than 2 or 3 more to climb before he reached the gap. He leaped without further hesitation. No sense waiting for them to sense his presence, assuming they hadn't already. 2 walls later, he got lucky. The last wall, complete with gap, was below him. Through it, he could see to the top of the dorm itself. There was an ant there, too. He unclipped his blazer and killed it, then dropped into the gully and looked through the gap. An ant looked back at him. Felix gasped and leaped back, firing from the hip. The ant, and 2 more behind it, were blazed down. The edges of the gap were immediately illuminated by bursts of blaster fire coming from the direction of the dorm. He wouldn't take a chance on looking through it now. Perhaps if he leaped quickly to the top of the wall itself? From opposite ends of the gully, ants appeared, firing blazers. He fired in both directions, slicing them apart. More blaster fire struck him, this time from the top of the wall he had just exited. How the hell did it get up there? He wondered. He wondered wildly, firing. That's where he had just been. More blasters erupted from the ends of the gullies. There didn't seem to be any place else to go. Felix leaped back up onto the next wall alongside the ant's body. The gully beyond was filled with them, all carrying blasters, all firing upward. He unclipped a blaze bomb and dropped it amid them, then tore off, running down the top of the wall as it blew. The wall ended suddenly. He leaped to the next. It collapsed beneath his weight, needlessly cushioning his fall and half burying him in the process. Blaster fire hit him from all directions. The ends of the gullies, the tops of the walls. Shit! They were following him along the tops of the walls. He threw blaze bombs in all directions. He fired at a lone ant blasting at him from what he hoped was the direction of the killing area and home. His blazing cut the ant in half. He hopped, running, over both halves and ran wildly past them. 20 seconds later, he had managed the smooth killing area. He ran down the runway, sidestepping the thousands of bodies, toward the fort. It took him another 20 seconds, but he was soon safely behind the walls. No one liked his report. He could understand that. The colonel eyed the pitifully meager data Felix had added to the screen. He tapped an armored finger on the surface. "It looks bad," he commented thoughtfully. Felix leaned forward and tapped his finger beside the colonel's. "Better here than there," he said pointedly. They sent him away, gruffly, angrily. They said they would call him when they needed him. Felix said he was afraid of that. An hour later he was back in the maze, perched atop a wall some 100 meters or so into it. The sighting was only slightly more extensive from this point of view than from the walls of the fort, and considerably more dangerous, but the brass had insisted. "We want all the extra warning we can get," the colonel had told him. That I can get, he amended, but only to himself. Fatheads, Felix thought from his perch. What was the point in building the goddamn bunker in the first place if they were going to send people out of it every chance they got? And for what? He was able to scan maybe 30 approaches more from where he was than the lookouts on the wall could see. But the nature of the maze screened at least that many. They could be closing and coming from almost any direction without him seeing them. Shit, he thought. Fatheads. Still, he had to admit he enjoyed talking to them, needling them. He was worried about some damage he might be doing to Schurn's career, but not enough to stop it. Frankly, he thought with a grin, he was having too much fun. He caught himself. Fun? That has 3 question marks after it. What's got into me anyway? Ants, reported a voice he didn't recognize, one of the other scouts similarly perched. Southeast from the bunker. Anybody else see 'em? Felix did. He said so. They were halfway across the maze and coming fast. Looks like some of 'em are sweeping for a southerly assault. He stood up unsteadily, tracking the bouncing skull heads in the distance. Major Ellicky cut into the frequency. He sounded breathless. Felix? Felix. Ants? Ants. What else? Felix barely hesitated. Just ants so far. Scouts in. With that, he cut the circuit and scrambled back toward the bunker. Felix knew better than to report to the command platform in person. After gathering all information from the other scouts, he sent Railsmith along with it. Then he looked for a seat among the scores of alerted warriors scrambling along the wall to watch. Dominguez appeared in front of him. He grabbed hold of Felix with both armored hands and held him still. He placed his faceplate against Felix's.
Just ants so far?
He echoed. And they both began to laugh. To giggle, really. Helplessly, they collapsed together. They laughed and laughed. What's got into me? He thought, trying to catch his breath. "6 hours and 45 minutes into the drop, the second attack began. It came from two directions at once, without pause between the waves. The main runway held the bulk of the attackers. The southern wall fought off the rest. Altogether, there were half again as many ants the second time. Wave after wave after wave. It didn't help. The ants were running into instant death, as before. It was brutal. It was ugly. It was short. Half an hour after the attack, the order came to go out for another specimen. Some lieutenant brought the message. Like Kent, Schön had been absent for quite a while. Felix and Dominguez went alone, leaving Morleone and Ling on the wall. There were ample targets. They found several ants not only alive, but apparently uninjured. They were tangled in the bodies of their dead, strung like jungle undergrowth in their path. From this grotesque trap, they managed to collect another 6 ideal samples. Oh, there is no another. From this grotesque trap, they managed to collect 6 ideal samples and return to the walls in less than 5 minutes flat. They sent Ling into the bunker with the spines. Felix informed the gunnery crew chief about the live ants. Thereafter, warriors took turns manning the cannon for signs of movement. Great fun was had watching the ants extricate themselves painfully, only to have their exoskeletal hides boiled away after 2 steps. The eighth order for Scouts Out meant, essentially, excuse me, my diaphragm's rebelling. The eighth order for Scouts Out meant, essentially, Felix and Railsmith. Since no activity, other than that among the dead and dying, had been sighted, they were sent ahead of the other scouts on a quick run up the runway itself to the ridge for a sighting. Felix was automatically dubious, but he followed the predetermined route, leading Railsmith up the slope between the piles of dead and the edge of the maze. He took a lot more time than the brass had wanted, however. Surprises meant a lot more outside the fort than just a report to the command platform. He needn't have bothered. They found nothing at all until they reached the dorm itself, and little there. Only a handful of ants were in sight, wandering aimlessly about outside the entrance. Felix was sure they were spotted, but, though 3 of the ants carried blasters, no effort was made to attack them. "Hard times at Antland," commented Railsmith with happy relief while Felix reported the situation. "Stay put and watch," was the word that came back to them minutes later. They obeyed without comment, sitting down side by side against a dune less than 100 meters from the perimeter of the dorm. Soon they were joined by 5 warriors bearing shovels, siliconite cylinders, and a case of blaze bombs. Felix and Railsmith got out of their way. 10 minutes later, forward observation post 1 was ready. It consisted of a curved, sheltered bowl from which sightings could be made in safe, seated comfort. Then the 5 warriors left to build Ops 2 and 3 farther down the line. "Looks like that's it," remarked Railsmith when they were alone once more. "What do you mean?" Felix asked. "The ants are finished," he replied. Then, when Felix was silent, he added, "Don't you think?" Felix considered a moment, said, "No." "Ah, come on, Felix. After all this?" Felix nodded. "And more." Railsmith was astonished. "You really think there's something to worry about?" "I don't know," Felix admitted after a moment. Maybe I'm just tired, Felix thought, and keyed a stimule. Railsmith was probably right. Almost certainly. But was it just too easy? Was that it? And what was wrong with it, if it was? They were sure due. Still, he felt uneasy, and oddly depressed. "Well," said Railsmith after a while, "we're sure as hell killing 'em. Doesn't that count for anything?" Felix sighed. "It never has before," he replied blandly. He began a 4-hour rest period at the 9th hour. By 9:05 he was inside the bunker, outside his suit, and under the shower. Dominguez was just reaching the squad bay when Felix emerged, dripping and smoking.
Did you see all those people coming down?
The sergeant asked him. Felix shook his head. "Who are they?"
Dunno, not warriors, just pea suits. All size pea suits at that.
Felix nodded. "Volunteers."
For what?
"For what?" asked Ling from the far bunk. Felix shrugged, smiled. "Well, we're out of ants." Schön found him in the mess, stuffing his face. "You'll get fat," she warned. Her face was glowing. He smiled. "That's the deal." "Look at this," she said, and slid a 2-dimensional hard copy of a computer holo under his nose. "Lovely," he said. She punched his arm. "Bastard, it's an X-ray of a ship." "Okay." "It's from the last batch you collected." She leaned over and pointed with her index finger. "Note these striations along the core. Here, too." He nodded. "It looks broken. Sorry, it looks cracked. Broken." "Uh-huh. As though badly healed. But it's not. It's badly grown." "Oh, it's an X-ray of a snip, not a ship. I misread that." "Bastard! It's an X-ray of a snip." "Okay, that's the spinal column segments they're taking out of them." "It's from the last batch you collected." She leaned over and pointed with her index finger. "Note the striations along the core. Here, too." He nodded. "It looks cracked. Broken." "Uh-huh. As though badly healed. But it's not. It's badly grown." He got it. "It's working?" he breathed. "Yep." He looked at her smiling face. "It's really working?" he exclaimed. She laughed. "It really is. Let's celebrate." He laughed as well. "Walk on the beach? The poison is lovely this time of drop." "I've got a better idea. Let's go to the old man's press tour. It's in the main hall. I've just been there, Felix. You should see it. It's jammed with reporters." He stared, remembering what Dominguez had said about the visitors. "You're joking. Here? On Banshee?" She gestured about them at the bunker walls. "Well, hardly on Banshee. Come on." He did. There were over 300 people in the main hall. There were the liaison officers he had heard so much about but were never seen, warriors rotated back inside for the rest like himself, all manner of techs, and reporters. Reporters everywhere. They ran up and down the aisles between the vast sea of well-scrubbed faces and freshly cleaned jumpsuits, shaking hands and gossiping. There were hearty greetings and heartier reunions. Felix found that it bothered the hell out of him. Shern had found them seats up front, just behind the top brass and assorted VIPs. She plopped down beside him only after several cheerful exchanges with superiors she didn't bother introducing to him. He thought it was just as well. He didn't feel like meeting anyone. It all seemed a little too eerie to concentrate. She waved an arm in a broad gesture which indicated the vast throng. "Fleet's finest," she proclaimed. "I believe you," he said seriously. Too seriously. She glanced sideways at him. "What's wrong?" He frowned. "I'm not sure." She was irritated. You're not still sneering at us, are you? We did it, didn't we? What else do we have to do to prove our competence?" He met her bitter gaze. "It's not that," he tried. She sniffed. "I should hope not. Let me tell you something, Felix. Some of the finest minds of manner in Fleet. Some are in this room right now." Somewhere deep within him, a bell rang. He sat forward in his chair. "That's it!" he whispered excitedly. "What's it?" she asked suspiciously. "That's the point. What are they doing here? What are they doing in Fleet?" She blinked. She was completely bewildered. For such a good fighter, Felix, are you anti-war? I mean, are you a pacifist? A pacifist? Was he? He thought back. He shook his head for a few moments, said, "No." She still wasn't happy. "It took you long enough." He looked at her. It was a long trip for it. Then the lights went down and the screen grew bright with the warm and winning smile of Brigadier Hamid Renault. Half an hour later, Felix decided the old man should have really become a vid star instead of a soldier. Though when he really thought about it, about the stone silent and unhelpful figure on the command platform, there was little evidence that he was a soldier at all. In any case, the man handled the tour brilliantly. He had a genuine gift for using the vid. Moving about through the bunker with monitors in tow, explaining what this was or that did, sliding jokes in and out without a scratch, he projected the model image of the humble soldier forced by his own excellence up through the ranks. He was terribly handsome as well, his huge screen face somehow capable of intimacy despite the vastness. Paternal, brotherly, and grand at will, he was, at the same time, the commander, favorite uncle, wise man, king, drinking buddy, and dad. Sexy, too, Felix assumed, glancing at Shern's upturned and attentive face. When the tour was almost over, the star was surprised with a plaque of gold, silver, and plasteel for which all personnel had supposedly contributed. Felix had not, to his knowledge, contributed a thing. No one had asked him to. Perhaps, he thought ruefully, they solicit during briefing, another thing they hadn't bothered him with. He glanced again at Shern. There was nothing wrong with her. It was just Banshee. On impulse, he reached over and patted her hand. She smiled, trapped it with one of hers, and smiled warmly, scaring him. "Want to go to a party?" Shern asked him when the show was over. She had left him briefly to huddle with her colleagues. She returned with an impish expression. "Where?" "A party, Felix. There's a terribly festive, incredibly illegal party going on even as we speak. Shall we?" He laughed. It was perfect. Of course these people would have a party afterward. He should have expected it. Before he'd go, he insisted on returning to the main seal and to the monitor banks beside it. The techs on duty before the screens assured him no trace of ant activity had surfaced. Further, there was no indication that any would appear. Felix nodded, allowed Schön to lead him to the feet. In truth, he hadn't expected trouble. He would have been greatly surprised had there been any. But that wasn't why he had gone to the monitors. He had gone to the monitors to warn himself. Banshee. Ants. Death. Still. Don't forget it, he thought to himself. He sighed. Was he being foolish? Was he... What the hell was he? He tossed the thoughts aside with another sigh, and hurried to keep up with Schön, anxious to rejoin her friends and the glowing novelty of this, their very first, really and truly, official Ant War camp-out. The party was indeed festive and most illegal, and therefore a great success. It was held in a sealed-off section of the second floor, an area housing most of the liaison observers and other fleet names. Technically, it was for the press only. In reality, it was for Kent. It was a ceremony, a rite, held in his name for all. The high point of the evening, Felix soon learned, was to be the awarding to Kent of his first battle ribbons. Felix loved the very idea of that. He noticed his own wide grin only when he caught himself laughing out loud at the sight of the forest of brass spread about the room awaiting the ribbon ceremony. His mysterious recklessness had returned, he noted dimly, but it didn't seem to matter. Not here. Everyone who is anyone is here, he said straight-faced to Schön, only to find that she had left him to join a gaggle of the like-minded. He shrugged and walked over to the bar and had a drink. His first since... Since when? Since that last night before. That first night before. That's with a capital B. As he tasted the first sip of beer, the knowledge that he must return to duty in a mere 4 hours, and the horror of the chance he was taking, seemed not only distant and irrelevant, it was macabrely funny. He forgot those thoughts, too. Half an hour later, he was mildly drunk. He didn't care. He was having too much fun enjoying the crowd. The food, too. Beside the bar was a long table covered with decorative knickknacks and, more importantly, many goodies. He had, on very first sight, officially designated the table as his all-time favorite fleet thing. He had remained within arm's length of it since that moment, sipping and munching and patting his happy tummy. Not that the chow aboard the Terra was bad, because it really wasn't. It was famous, in fact, for being the very best to be had aboard warships. Felix accepted this oft-repeated accolade without examination, though the image of gourmets making a culinary pilgrimage between warships did not come easily to him. On the other hand, he conceded, it was no sillier a use for faster than light than rending exoskeleton. Even Hamad Renault made appearances. Every half hour he would stop by just long enough to receive his due before assuming the truly perfect expression of the great leader who, though at heart a fun-loving fellow, was nevertheless far too dedicated to allow his personal needs to come before his noble suffering neath the awesome burdens of command.
Wish I could play hooky and stay, he would remark with a twinkle before leaving to return to unspecified duties.
But then, almost exactly half an hour later, he would return and do and say it all again. Felix wondered what the man did in the meantime. Watched the clock, probably. It made him a bit queasy at first. Later, he enjoyed even this. But more than anything else, he loved watching Kent. He hadn't seen him since the trouble at the dorm. He had assumed this was because of Kent's embarrassment at freezing up under fire. If so, he seemed to Felix to have gotten over it. Warm and friendly to all, tall and handsome, exuding twin auras of goodwill and unintentional physical intimidation, he really was everything Forrest had said he was. The shyness was there, too, broadcasted by his pained efforts to conceal it. It was a genuine attempt, Felix knew, to be what everyone seemed to need him to be, the lion he resembled. Felix smiled and sipped. He knew a thing or two about lions, and Kent wasn't in it. Nowhere near arrogant enough. It was Felix's firm conviction, furthermore, that it was no loss. None at all. "Gentle is better," he whispered, tilting his glass at the handsome features across the sea of admiring officers and press. Then Kent saw him looking, and everything changed. At first Felix thought it had been his imagination. Kent's sudden paled expression couldn't be due to recognition, he thought. How would he know me outside my armor? It soon became apparent, however, that Kent did know him, knew, in fact, every move he made through the crowd. Every few seconds or so, Felix would catch Kent watching him. He would always look away when their eyes met, but he would be looking again a few seconds later. Looking and drinking. He drank a hell of a lot, even. Or especially. Oh, sorry, I just misread the punctuation there. That's on me. Not poorly written, poorly read. He drank a hell of a lot, even, or especially, for a well-tuned athlete. Felix was becoming alarmed, and he wasn't the only one. The first time Kent staggered, the entire horde seemed to bow with the shock of the sight of it. Felix hated it. He wasn't equipped for it. He wasn't adequate. Not now. Not any more. He left quietly, sliding unobtrusively out the door as the ribbon ceremony began. Shern caught him outside in the passageway. "Where you goin'?" she wanted to know. He said something about being on duty in 2 more hours, and too much to drink and such. She took a step closer and rested a hand on his shoulder. "Have you forgotten how to have a good time?" she asked. He ignored the sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. He smiled badly. He said he hadn't forgotten. Shern eyed him suspiciously. "Are you sure that's true?" she demanded. He paused. "Sure it's true!" he exclaimed. He smiled again. He patted her on the shoulder. He walked away. And it was true, he said to himself as he entered the lift. He did remember. He did. He just wasn't sure that was enough. He smoked and dripped, watching himself in the mirror on the far wall. He watched without passion. Numb. Tired. Suspended between. Somewhere out there were so many, many things. The horror of the ants. The legions of their dead strewn about on the sand. The memory of how it was done and of how it had been done in the past. The past. That was out there, too, hovering between the laughter of the child warriors and their party and visions of killing ants one by black bleeding one. Kent came in. They stared at one another in the mirror. Finally, Felix indicated a spot on the bench before him, and Kent sat there. He was holding a bottle. He offered it. Felix drank. Then he spoke. He told Kent about Forrest. He told it straight through, without pause, without emotion. His voice echoed hollowly in the empty chamber. Kent began to cry. After a while, Felix did too. But he didn't stop. He finished it. He emptied it out of himself with his voice. Then Kent hit him. No, no, he thought as he crashed backwards over the benches to the floor. It couldn't have happened. It wasn't possible. He peered uncomprehendingly upward at Kent, his mind racing desperately for an alternative. There was none. "I know what you think of me," groaned Kent, his voice rasping mercilessly. "You think I killed her because I didn't kill her. Who cares? I loved her too, maybe. Not like maybe I I didn't. You bastard! He screamed and slammed his foot into Felix's side. It doesn't mean I'm small! Felix cried out in pain, sharp, strident, helpless again. He fainted. Dominguez found him and questioned. Felix told him too much to drink. He was fine, though. Dominguez watched his face a long time before answering. Sure, man, said Dominguez, and helped him to his feet. That could have gone better. Felix was once more at observation post 1 when at Felix was once more at observation post 1 when, at 27 minutes into the 13th hour, the third attack began. It was pitiful. The ants were, quite literally, pale imitations of their former selves. Their hides appeared unformed, almost translucent. Their awkward gait was barely sufficient to carry them up out of the darkness toward the waiting warriors. Fewer than 200 ants appeared. Felix glanced at the dozen warriors inhabiting the vastly enlarged OP with him. He decided their make-work project of expanding the OP might come in handy. He tongued the command frequency and told them about the attack. Then he told them he and the dozen warriors could handle it on the spot. The reply was lost to him the first time. It was the siliconite, he had been told, that was responsible for the gradual deterioration of communication. He waited a couple of seconds and tried again. This time, the voice from the command platform came through. Distorted, but coherent enough. Go ahead, a bored voice advised him. Suddenly, another voice grated onto the circuit. Felix recognized Major Elliky's businesslike tones. Don't attack! Repeat! Don't attack! Let them through! You hear me, Felix? I hear you, Major. You want us to let them through? Right? Why? But there was no answer. Static, possibly. He told the others. As they gathered up the gear and prepared to pull out, one of the warriors turned to Felix. How come, Scout? What's the point of not killing 'em now? Felix said he didn't know, but he should have seen it. It was the press. They had already taken vids of the battlefield, carpeted with blasted ants. They had gotten the warriors, too. And the bunker, and the walls, and, recently, Kent's ribbon ceremony. Now they were going to get a real-life ant slaughter. Felix and Dominguez stood side by side on the wall among the jumble of reporters and tourists and watched the cannon crews toy with the last of the enemy. Holy shit! Dominguez exclaimed suddenly. He slapped an armored hand against Felix's back. We beat 'em, Felix! He said, amazement in his voice. We beat 'em! By God, said Felix as it also dawned. You're right. We did. We really did. The two of them thought about that in silence a while until Shern appeared beside them. I want a sample or two as soon as possible, she said. Dominguez laughed. Hell, Colonel, it's possible right now, he said, and hopped over the wall. The battle, such as it was still going on, and for one heart-stopping instant Felix thought the man would get a cannon in his back. But the crews spotted him in time and held their fire. Then Dominguez proceeded to take 3 samples of ant spines before the eyes of mankind. There was much cheering when he hopped back over the wall carrying the snips. Reporters converged on him as if magnetized. Felix and Shern laughed, applauding awkwardly with plasteel palms. Felix spent the early part of his 15th hour on the drop of a solo scan of the area surrounding the dorm. He found no ants, no signs of them. He was alone. On his way back he found an ant blaster. On impulse he retrieved the heat weapon. Inside the fort, the reporters went crazy over the alien instrument of terror. The brass, seeing the possibilities, decided to debrief their scout while surrounded by vids. Felix went along, telling before the crowd what he had just finished saying to the brass alone. No ants. He was amazed at how many different ways Major Alecky used to draw the... Oh, sorry. He was amazed at how many different ways Major Alecky used to draw the session out. But he played along. No ants was reported many ways. Later, they wanted an interview inside the bunker. Felix knew better than to expose his face. He declined, answering questions in his suit instead. The first interrogator sought patriotism.
I bet you'll be glad when Banshee is ours, won't you?
Felix said that would be good.
Aren't you excited by the prospect?
I guess, Felix replied, but I wouldn't want to live here. Would you?
Living here afterward is hardly the point of the fighting, soldier.
I hope you're right, replied Felix with apparent earnest. Another reporter wanted to come along on the next scouting mission. Felix asked her if she wanted to die.
What do you mean? She scoffed. There aren't any more ants, are there?
I didn't see any, he corrected, but you're wearing a pea suit. You don't need ants to get killed in that.
Huh?
You could cough a hole in that. She looked alarmed. She fingered the material with concern.
You really think so?
Felix really thought so. It's a towel, he assured her. She walked away, looking fretful. Given an hour off, he went indoors and took another shower. Schön was there when he stepped out. They talked while he dried. It was only when he started to go that he saw it. She blocked the door.
You knew what I was up to at the party, didn't you? That's why you ran off.
He didn't know what to say. He didn't...
I had thought it might be a little war injury or some such,
she said with a cackle, blatantly eyeing his nakedness. He looked at her, becoming conscious for the first time of her appearance. Blonde hair, blue eyes, beauty. Canada. He touched her face. It's too late now, I say. I'm not going to do a Canadian, okay? He touched her face. Before that, he said gently. Then he shuffled quite quickly past her, unwilling to summon more. Again? He asked.
Again, Colonel Kudar assured him. We've already got the OPs manned, but we want another run at Dorm itself. You've got the experience. You've got the job.
Yes, sir, he replied. Why not? There was nothing else to do, and they wouldn't be leaving, the old man had announced, until the 18th hour. Our job here, he had announced with classic drama, is done. Evidently, Felix's was not. He hopped over the wall and trotted the length of the runway to the ridge. When he reached OP1, he was given the unsurprising news that nothing had happened. Kudar had told him to check in when he reached the OP. He did.
Very good, Felix,
said the colonel with great deliberation. Even through the grinding static, Felix gathered they had an audience. The press, he figured.
Now make another turn around the dorm perimeter, if you please.
Felix was pleased to do that. Why not? He reported again when he'd finished. Still nothing to see.
Very good, Felix,
sounded, crackling, once more from Kudar.
Now, if you would, I'd like an eyeball of the immediate area in front, inside the crater.
Okay, he could do that. Why not? And he did. The area in front of the dark and gaping triangular entrance was absolutely smooth, absolutely flat. Felix reported the neatness of the ants.
Very good, Felix,
intoned the colonel one more time. Then,
how about taking a look inside?
Felix shrugged. How about it? Just a quick little... He froze. He had actually taken a step to do it. He peered into the darkness looming over him. The bunker had been a good idea after all. The drop had been one of the easiest he could remember. The party had been fun. But no more. Not one step more. Unconsciously, he backed to the edge of the perimeter, his eyes still riveted on the blackness, on the depth of it. Every instinct told him that first step through would be that one step too many. Suddenly, the idea of doing it, of almost having done it, clutched him. His mouth went dry. He trembled. He refused.
What if I made that an order?
Snapped the colonel, his voice fading slightly. Make it a threat if you like, Felix snapped back. I ain't going. There were several clicks and pops having nothing to do with the static. He assumed the press people were no longer eavesdropping.
Felix, said Kudar, go down that hole.
Colonel, said Felix, no. There was a pause. A different voice sang out. Return to the OP and stand by. Okay, he thought. Why not? It was the old man's voice, he realized at once. The brigadier, Hamad Renault himself. And he was making it a threat, after all. If I have to get someone else, barked the CO,
it'll cost you. I can promise you that.
Now, I want you to apologize publicly to Ali, Colonel Kudar, and carry out your mission. Is that understood? Felix sighed. I know what you want, if that's what you mean. No. A pause. Mr. Felix, is that your final word? No, it isn't, he snapped. He was suddenly furious, livid with rage. Old man, you shoot some other hero down that hole and you kill him. I know. I know Ants and I know Banshee and I know you do not. So listen. Now you just shut your... How many drops you had, old man? A pause. Felix went on. I've had 20. You send somebody else and you kill him. I know it. You should know it. And when he doesn't come back, and you can be sure he will not, everybody else is going to know it. Another pause. Longer. The circuit severed. A few minutes later, the 5 warriors manning OP-1 were recalled. Felix was told to stay put in the same breath. No explanation. Half an hour later, Colonel Kudar called. Even through the interference, Felix could tell he was making great effort to control his anger.
Since you're not obeying any more orders, Mr. Felix, allow me to suggest you stay where you are until called, which won't be, I'm reasonably certain, until our guests have departed. Can we expect your cooperation?
Of course, Felix replied pleasantly. When do they leave?
Hour 18.
Fine.
One last thing, Felix. A personal item.
Felix groaned. Is it necessary?
I believe so,
retorted the colonel, his voice an icy whip.
This may be my last chance to tell you what I think of you.
Oh, well, Ali, Felix drawled. I was hoping it'd be about those warriors you lost at the dorm this morning. Another click. Decisive. He was alone again. He sat. When he saw when he saw Kent coming, he checked the time. Amazingly, over an hour and a half passed. He blinked, considered. But he could not recall a single thought he had had during that period. He stood for Kent. The apology was stumbling but sincere. Felix's acceptance was equally sincere. But Kent kept apologizing. Every time I think about what I did, I throw up, he said. Felix laughed.
You don't believe me? Don't you believe me?
Asked Kent stiffly. As a matter of fact, I do, said Felix. It's you. He sat, motioned for Kent to do the same. Forrest would say it's the best of you.
It's not the me I want,
said Kent unhappily. You want? Echoed Felix.
Yes, me. I want to be more tougher, I guess.
Felix laughed again. You were pretty tough a couple of hours ago. Felix could almost feel the other man's face crimson.
You know that's not what I mean,
said Kent. Yeah. Kent shifted.
I want to be more like she was, I guess. Like you are.
Felix stared at a patch of sand between his boots. Like her, maybe. Like her, maybe. Not me.
You're a hell of a fighter, Felix,
insisted Kent.
You'd have to be...
Oh, so the Canada reference before was in reference to Forrest. Sorry. I apologize. No, it was Shern. That's just her name. Don't mind me. I'm losing the plot.
You know what I mean.
Felix stared at a patch of sand between his boots. Like her, maybe. Not me.
You're a hell of a fighter, Felix, insisted Kent. You'd have to be. And, anyway, Canada saw you.
Felix laughed shortly. Canada Shern. Combat vet? Combat vet? Kent laughed, embarrassed.
Well, she knows what she saw.
No, she doesn't, Felix heard himself suddenly snap. None of you... He stopped, paused. Kent had tensed like a spring he saw. Oh, well, he began again. So you want to be a combat soldier, and you feel bad that you haven't been.
Why shouldn't I?
Felix eyed him. He shrugged. I don't know. He glanced away, toward the dorm. He looked back a second later. But did it ever occur to you that you're the only one of us to ever put this hardware to decent use? There was another pause after that. A long one. Felix spent it wondering how he could have lost an hour and a half.
I want to be a real fighter,
Kent said suddenly. Huh? What's that?
Oh, you know, against ants and...
Ho ho, growled Felix, his voice sounding bitter even to him. You want to be a killer. He stood up. He looked at the other man. That's what I really am, Nathan. I'm a killer. I don't fight 'em. I kill 'em. That's how I've managed it. Kent stared upward at him.
What's the difference?
He asked gently. Felix found he could not look at him. He turned away. I don't know, he replied, not at all certain it was true. They were quiet after that. Felix's mind was blank. Flexed blank. Shern called at the 18th hour. I'm supposed to tell you two to stand at parade rest. Felix cocked his head. I beg your pardon?
Has the service started?
Sorry.
Has the service started?
Asked Kent. About to, she told him. Kent turned to Felix.
They're holding a memorial service for the 9 we lost at the dorm this morning.
Oh. They stood, clasping gloves behind their backs. After a few seconds, Felix sat down again.
What's the matter?
Kent asked. What do you mean? Shern wanted to know.
It's Felix. He sat down.
I'm tired, Felix said quietly. They heard Shern laughing. Don't blame you, Felix. Lots of folks up here would like to lie down after all the partyings they've been working at.
Still?
Asked Kent. Sure, up to about half an hour ago, she giggled. The whole place is drunk, if you ask me. Kent sat down, next to Felix. Nathan, Felix, the service is on Command 3 if you want to tune in. Felix shook his head. I'll pass.
Me too,
said Kent. She sighed loudly. I don't blame you. Pretty dreary. Felix, what you been doing all this time?
Policing the area, he replied dryly. She laughed. Then, abruptly, she groaned.
My God! She exclaimed. What was that? Did you two feel that?
Feel what?
Asked Kent. I don't know. I guess it was an earthquake or Banshee quake. Oops! There it goes again.
Felix was already to his feet and moving. The fear rushed like burning tendrils down the back of his neck and across his shoulder blades.
Don't you feel it, you two? She persisted. You should. You're only about...
Canada! Felix all but shouted. Get to the...
Well, damn it, she continued without hearing. I can't believe you didn't feel that fun.
Canada! Felix barked. Get inside! Get in the bunker! He began to run toward the fort. Kent seemed to get it at the same moment. He barely hesitated before following. Canada! Felix called again.
Yes, Felix, I'm here. You don't have to blast my ears.
Are you doing it? Are you going to the bunker?
Well, no. Why should...
Damn you, Shern! Felix snapped. You want to die?
It's just a tremor, Felix. Get hold of your...
Shern, that's no quake. Remember where you are. Remember what lives here, what lives underground. Get everybody inside. There was no reply. Canada? Kent called. Canada! Answer! Her scream began as a low whimper, plaintive and childlike, before swelling suddenly, horribly, across the spectrum until it burst forth as the blood-curdling cry of a grown woman gripped by ultimate terror.
Oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God! Felix! Felix! Ants! Ants! Ants!
There was no one in sight as they streaked to the foot of the forward wall. Felix glanced briefly at Kent, rolling alongside. He had told the other man nothing to tell him. Don't panic at what you see. Nothing else could mean anything. Kent had soaked it up like a sponge. Jump onto the wall, not over it, Felix cautioned him, one final time as they leapt side by side into the air. This was the only way home. This is the only way home, he reminded himself. He was unprepared for the sight. It stunned him. It staggered him. He could not, would not believe it for the first precious idle instant. Writhing slaughter swirled beneath them. It was jammed tight from wall to wall. It was a nightmare. Thousands of ants. Oh my God, Kent gasped, as though wounded already. For the first few seconds it was hard to distinguish any detail. Then a warrior was spotted, then another. Over there a mob of 15 or so wedged back to back and going down. Another smaller pack there, a group of 50 scattering, a lone suit frozen in traction mode, another obscenely imploding, blazers sweeping wildly, panicky, over their heads. The main seal was buried from sight behind the trembling horde fighting to enter it. Wake up! He screamed to himself. React! Erupt! But he only stared. There's thousands of them. How? How? Kent wailed. Felix shook himself. He scanned, pointed. There were 3 roughly circular holes in the northeast corner of the compound. Ants poured from each. Faded ants, he saw then. The tired ones they had fought that last time. Weak and... But so many. So many. Come on, he said to Kent and rushed along the top of the wall to the corner. He unclipped 3 blaze bombs as he moved. He dropped the first 2 in the first 2 holes. The third was partially blocked by a bright orange engineer's pea suit, being dragged, carried, struggling, down into oblivion. Felix hesitated but a moment on a man he could do nothing for, then dropped the third bomb into the darkness where the orange had just been. Kent looked sideways at him, then back down as the bombs flew.
Sand, dust, ants, and quite a bit of orange material vaulted up from the shadows before raining back upon the collapsing sides of the holes. Not much, Felix muttered, almost to himself. Something. Above him, the barrel of a blazer cannon pointed into the sky. Hey! He hopped up into the cockpit, stomping down hard on the swivel bar. It rotated smoothly to the right and stopped, pointing down the length of the outer wall. He tried the other direction. The barrel stopped again, just as before. A safety measure, of course. He kicked the turret as hard as he could. Then he hopped off. He tried adjusting the gearing directly. He tried altering the mechanism underneath. He even tried lifting the entire assembly from its anchor. But it wouldn't budge.
Here,
said Kent, shouldering him aside and grabbing hold of each end. With a single heave, he ripped the turret, the chair, and the cannon right up out of the wall.
grab that.
Added Kent, indicating the ruptured foundation rod with a massive nod of his great blue helmet. Felix grabbed it, planted his feet firmly, and tried to keep from being thrown into the killing by the violent torque of Kent ripping the cannon free from the rest with a single twist of his armored wrists. Felix knew he'd have to take the time to be impressed by that some day.
Where do I shoot? There's people in them and...
Felix pointed to an area just in front of the main seal. A defensive formation of sorts had formed. But there were so many ants, and so many who didn't know what to do, and so many more without weapons, only pea suits that seemed to be tearing whenever he saw them, ripping and flapping and... Just there, Felix said shortly. Protect the bunker door.
But there's people. I'll kill them too.
Yes. Kent stared at him. Felix stared back, then pointed again. He heard Kent sigh, but he pointed the cannon and pressed the key. Nothing happened. Damn it! Felix snapped. We ripped the feeder loose, too.
I can fix that, said Kent. This suit of mine...
His voice trailed off as he concentrated his attention on something in a pouch under an armpit. A feeder line. He ripped the shattered ends of the other feeder free, then snapped his into its place. He touched the trigger key. A blue blazer beam shot forth. It was thick and bright and damn near as strong as the original. From his suit alone, Felix thought in awe. Then he slapped the other man's shoulder and said, gruffly, "Shoot!" Kent shot. He hated it, Felix knew, and he groaned whenever the beam swept over a human form, which was often, but he shot. Slowly, the pressure on the mob before the main seal began to lessen. But on the wall itself, it began to get tight. They were the only ones on the wall, the only ones providing any outside help, the only ones giving hope. The ants rushed over one another to kill them. Felix got very busy trying to keep Kent alive long enough to do any good. They clambered upward at them, piling atop one another, straining, arching up to the walkway. As they reached it, Felix began killing them. He shot them in two, between their globular eyes or sections, toppling their top halves over backwards, the blood spewing and staining. He killed with efficiency and with dispatch. He killed with the touch of experience. But he was killing alone. And slowly, he was becoming aware of it. He shot to his left and his right, and between his feet, and when the rifle began to heat up, he punched the toe of his right boot at a head, and it lopped off. Weaker ants. Weaker. Cheaper just to do it that way, and he did. He kicked them and punched them and swung his rifle stock, shattering and bashing them. They died in bunches. But they came in greater bunches, and it was starting to get very, very tight and scary. All of them swarmed at him now, the real threat, and not at Kent, whose destruction was distant and uninvolved. Gradually his rifle cooled, and he could use it again, and he did, wondering how much power was left within it. But there was no time to stop and check. They came at him from both sides and in front, all along the wall now, and surging at him. And still he killed them. but he was doing it alone. The engine had not come. It hadn't come all along, not since that first one at the beginning of the drop, that first one that had surprised him. The engine hadn't been there either. Where was it? Where are you? Help me! Lift me! Erupt, damn it! Erupt! But it wasn't there. He was alone with just his body and his fear, and he hated this, hated it as he always knew he would. He turned his head toward Kent for what? Assurance? Shit! He snapped his head back to the job. He was alone. Okay, okay. And he killed some more until the rifle stopped working, and then he used the heavy end of it to cleave and bash, and then he saw that Kent was no longer shooting, had dropped the cannon. He clouted his shin alongside a clacking mandible mouth, leaped over several outstretched claws, and trotted along the top of the wall to Kent.
It was draining me,
Kent explained guiltily. Don't worry about it, damn it! He growled, slapping the other's shoulder as he passed. Come on! He led them again to the northeast corner and around it. Below, the swarming ants swayed with the change of direction, like waving grain before a gust of wind. They want us so bad, he thought. We gotta get inside while there still is one. It looked like they might have a chance to do it. Kent's brief attack had been devastating for a while. The ants had thinned noticeably. Clear territories were beginning to develop in the shifting crush below. But the number of blazers still working, always heartbreakingly small, had likewise diminished. They were still being overcome by the ants, still being killed, still being pulled apart. They were still losing, and they were still going to lose. But if they could get inside and use the protected transit cone... He pulled them up short when they were even on the wall with the main seal. He turned to Kent. We've got to go down in there in front of that seal and bust up that mob. Nobody can get in now. You see? Kent followed his gaze to the wedged bodies shifting below. Ants were swarming at them, dragging individuals away from the outer limits of the pack. The others seemed too panic-stricken to fight back. They simply pressed closer to the seal itself, making it impossible for anyone to use it. The only actual fighting being done was by the poor lost souls who were cut off in the surge of ants. They fought, mostly alone, and died, without hope of reaching the bunker itself. Yet the sheer numbers of ants these few drew to themselves could make it possible for the sheep at the seal.
Okay,
Kent said sharply, without conviction. Felix paused the briefest moment and looked at him, peering through the clear faceplate to the pale face behind it. Kent was willing, but he... This isn't for you, Felix thought. Then he leaped off the wall into the compound. Kent followed. At that instant, the fourth tunnel opened. Ants streamed up into the center of the compound, 5 abreast. The jamming horde before the main seal, now close enough for proximity band, seemed to fill their ears with a single mindless scream of horror.
Felix! Felix, look!
Kent cried.
We can't...
Felix knew what he meant. They were cut off. They'd never hoped to reach the seal through this new surge. He pointed to a relatively clear space in the corner between the bunker's northern face and the northern wall. Not because he had hope or because he had a plan. It was simply a clear space, and the ants were coming. So many! God, so many! Kent followed him. There were perhaps 3 ants in their path. Felix carved through them with his speed and his forearms and his fear. He heard Kent grunting behind him with efforts of his own. And then they were there in the corner. But he didn't know what to do, where to lead them next. Up onto the walls once more? But here was the hope. Here was the only way home, and he didn't know what to do. He didn't. And the engine would not come. Dimly, he realized Kent was calling to him, pulling at him frantically.
This way, Felix! This way, Felix!
He was yelling, and Felix looked where he pointed and saw the squat little cube nestled against the outer wall of the bunker. A door? A hatch? Did it go inside? Then the surge of ants hit them, and he struck out at them, splintering their faded bodies and their poorly honed exoskeletons and their pale, dead, globular eyes. Different, somehow, shinier and slippery, or...
Felix, the hatch! Help me!
Kent shouted from very close. He rocketed a fist through an eye into the brain case of the ant directly before him, killing it instantly, and jamming it up in the clattering hooves of the one behind it. He half leapt into the air, scissoring his legs, and slammed first one and then two boots up through the shattering hide of a gaping mandible. Then he spun about, his arms unfolding, and beheaded the one behind against his right wrist. Black blood gushed and sprayed high into the air. But he was gone when it fell, jamming past the bodies of the dead and reaching, claws of the deadly, to Kent, who stood, miraculously, beside the open hatch, the handle of the hinged door in his hand. His other arm was out before him, blazing apart the rush with a pitifully translucent beam.
Inside!
Kent yelled. Felix nodded, already in the air. They dropped together into the darkness. The hatch slammed shut over their heads as they struck bottom, 5 meters below. It was dead still. Absolute quiet. Absolute emptiness. "Where the hell?" Felix asked.
Don't you know?
Asked Kent, bewildered. "Just tell me, Kent, 'cause nobody else has, right?" Kent hesitated, taken aback briefly. Then he hurriedly explained.
This is the concussion cellar, in case of artillery. The air in here is supposed to compress instead of the walls of the bunker.
"Oh. Does it work?"
Kent shrugged. It's new.
"Can we get inside the bunker from in here?"
Huh? Yes, we can. I forgot. Here, down the passage.
The chamber they were in was 10 meters square. At the far end of it stood a heavy plasteel door. Kent reached to grasp its oversized handle.
There's a passage behind here that leads to a... Shit.
"What's the matter?" Kent jerked at the door.
It's stuck.
"Perfect!" Felix snarled.
Wait a minute.
Gasped Kent. He took his glove from the handle and placed it flat against the door itself. Holding it so, he worked keys on the inside of his forearm with his other hand. Suddenly he jerked back from it, banging into Felix. "What's the matter?" Kent looked at him.
Ants.
He pointed a finger.
Behind the door. Lots of them.
Felix stepped up, placing a hand on the plasteel. "Trying to get through, you think?" Kent shrugged.
I guess. Something's jammed it.
Felix dropped his hand. "Is there another way?"
No.
"Shit." From somewhere overhead, a thunderous blast rang out. The floor of the chamber rocked violently under their boots. Sand rained from the high ceiling. "About goddamn time!" Felix snapped happily.
Reinforcements! Gasped Kent with equal pleasure. Those are concussion grenades. We use them in the...
A second blast rocked them, followed by a third and fourth in quick succession. The floor trembled crazily. The walls bowed inward, shimmering. The falling sand became a continuous cloud. Kent laughed uneasily.
If they're not careful, they're gonna...
A searing, bursting shockwave slammed them to the floor. The walls across the chamber buckled and split, spewing a huge chunk of plastiform into the ceiling. The ceiling, already bowing, split in turn. Great plastiform beams tore loose from their moorings and crashed to the floor all around them. Several holes burst open in the ceiling itself. Sand poured through in huge quantities, piling into cones that spilled toward them. "Look out!" Felix warned Kent as a chunk fell heavily to the floor just behind him.
Oh, God!
Kent screamed, pointing back the other way. Felix turned to look just as the great plasteel door exploded from its hinges. Ants boiled out of the choked passage toward them. And then it was happening again, and he lashed out at them, bashing them with his forearms or boots or butt of the rifle. But without the engine and its strength. Alone still, and knowing it. Only his experience and his fear and the knowledge of nowhere else to go. Kent, no killer, was awesome still. He obliterated them with the thunderous sweeps of his fists. He lifted chunks of plastiform and threw them. He threw beams, too. And sand. And much, much fear. They were holding their own for several seconds and more. But it was a useless struggle with only one outcome, only one end, with the swarming upon them, pulling and tearing and raking at faceplates and seams, exhausted last-ditch struggles using energy as well applied to the screams. Exhausted last-ditch struggles using energy as well applied to the screams equally certain to come. "The hatch!" Felix shouted. "We've got to get back!" Kent nodded. He heaved a long length of plastiform beam, so big Felix could not have lifted it, at the nearest swelling gang, flattening the first four outright. The two of them took advantage of the momentary pause to back up quickly to where the hatch had been. When they got there, it was gone. "Oh no!" Kent wailed. In place of the hatch was a warped square of plasteel crammed awkwardly into a sunlit manhole. The grenades had blown their exit apart. "Try anyway," urged Felix, shoving Kent forward. "Try jumping up through it." When Kent hesitated, he shoved him again. "Try, damn it! Come on! You can see the sky up there!" Kent nodded, flexed his knees to leap, and another explosion staggered them. More plastiform, more sand, cascaded from the walls and ceiling. Felix righted himself with difficulty. The sand was almost thigh-deep now, and it hampered his movements. It hampered the ants as well, but not nearly so much. One vaulted forward at him out of the raining, pouring sand, its claws hammering at his helmet, its pincers snapping audibly for his middle. Felix threw himself back, drew a boot up. The boot struck the ant's pelvis joint, snapping it cleanly. But the upper ant grasped him still, raking and reaching. He brought his palms up lightning quick from his sides and slammed them into the eyes. They exploded. The ant slid off as he turned once more to Kent.
"I'm gonna try it," Kent yelled. "It's better, see?"
Felix looked up. The plasteel hatch was gone. An uneven square of daylight remained. He nodded. "Go!" Kent went. It was a sloppy, uneven jump. The sand packed about his legs threw him off balance. But he made it, his arms darting up and grasping the edges of the hole and raising him up. Another ant slammed into Felix through the sand. He tore its head off in his hands and threw it at the one coming behind. His boot touched something hard. He reached into the soft, powdery sand between his boots and pulled out a helmet-sized chunk of plastiform. The second ant, hardly delayed by the skull, died instantly, beheaded, as Felix drove the chunk against and through its thorax.
"Felix, come on!"
Kent shouted. "Right!" he called back. He stepped under the hole, aimed his leap. Another ant piled into him from the rear. He struck out blindly with his armored elbow, slamming it piston-like against the great skull repeatedly. He felt the grip of the claws slip once, twice, then fall away. He should have jumped then, right then. But he turned around instead, wary and fearful of more to come. They were coming. Four abreast, staggered, tumbled forward, claws stretched out and working. He should have jumped then, too. Right then. He should have tried for the only way out. He should have known better. The engine would have. But the engine was gone. And Felix, left behind, could think of nothing but running. And he did, away from the ants, away from the hole. When it was too late, when he was too far away to go back, he stopped and tried. He and the ants hurtled toward each other. The chamber, by now nothing more than a half-filled cavern, pitched suddenly sideways, throwing him off balance to one side. He heard a deep, tremulous grinding and looked up to see an entire section of the ceiling collapsing upon him. He jerked spastically away, rolling on his side in the cloying sand. The section crashed into the sand less than a hand's width away from his hip. "Get up! Get up!" he screamed inwardly. "Move!" And he did, rising quickly but unsteadily. Too much! Too much at once, and the ants! God, I'm so sick of—
Felix! Felix, where the hell are you?
I'm here!
I can't see you.
Nor could he make out the hatch. It was almost completely blocked by the debris. And the ants? Crushed, he saw a second later. Some of them. How close they had been! Then he saw the sunlight. The hatch, he thought, and lurched forward. But it wasn't the hatch. It was a thin fissure opened by the shifting cavern. But it was far too small. He could never— He spun about as more ants clamored toward him around the remnants of the ceiling.
Felix!
"I can't get there!" he heard himself screech. "Damn! Get me a blazer!" he yelled in a more controlled tone. "Or something!"
You can't get back up?
Kent persisted. "Ants!" he gasped, wanting simply to sink to his knees. The shouting exhausted him. "They're between us!"
Felix, I'm coming to help.
The blatant sham of the tone touched him. He drew himself up sharply, feeling a hard and bitter grin tighten about his mouth. "No, you're not. But you've got to say it, don't you, hero?"
Felix?
Kent called, from the sound not one bit closer. "Yes, Nathan," he hissed. There was a short pause. Felix used it to throw a chunk of masonry at an oncoming ant. The trouble was he couldn't see at all, and the sensors were sharply localized by the siliconite hanging in the air.
Felix, do you want me to come?
That, too. He must let him off the hook as well. Great. Never mind. It's over. Do it. No, Nathan, they'd only get you too. Save yourself.
Well, if you're sure.
Felix threw his head back, wickedly. Cackling wickedly. Fuck you, hero, he thought. Then he decided to say it. Fuck! And then again the cavern pitched. The entire center support system collapsed during the rocking. A single beam, jutting up at a slant from the floor, was struck just right by a falling block. The beam seesawed wildly, a fulcrum, vaulting up out of the soft sand. It flattened two ants against the remainder of the ceiling. Felix shook himself. He realized he'd been just staring. There was something he should have been doing instead of just— "You fool!" he groaned disgustedly. He'd been waiting for Kent to come anyway. "Fool!" he said again. "Come on, damn you!" He was urging no particular direction. He had no plan. He was just calling the engine, beckoning, beseeching. He moaned as he tripped over something he couldn't see and banged his chin. It didn't hurt, of course. He wasn't hurt. He was just falling apart, cracking like the goddamned bunker. More ants stumbled toward him. He turned away. Distantly, he heard Kent's faint voice calling. The debris and the siliconite had finally cut him off completely. He tried once to understand what Kent was saying, but it was too faint and too late. He remembered the fissure. He turned his head. It was there, small and narrow, too narrow. They'd catch him up there, he knew. Sure as hell, they'd come up and pull him down and— "Shut up!" he barked loudly. He stomped through the cloying sand to the sharp rays of sunlight. What choice was there? Sit and wait for him? Not these bastards, he thought angrily, as though he both knew and disliked them personally. He paused beneath the fissure. The first part looked possible. He leaped and grabbed the edges. He pulled himself up, wedging past the first bottleneck with considerable difficulty. The siliconite again. It made it hard to shove through. The sand was firmer, less yielding. He looked up. It got narrower. He'd never make it all the way. What else then? Pop his suit when they came? Damn. He planted his boots and wedged himself up past the second bottleneck. He stopped halfway through, caught. He'd hung up on something. He reached back and unclipped the culprit, his last blaze bomb. He reattached it on the other side. Why'd you bother? He asked himself when he'd finished. Planning to end it that way? A blaze bomb would do breathtaking things in this rat hole, sure enough. Entomb him, for one. Damn it! Damn you! The ugly goddamn sky is right there! Move! And he lurched upward. He jammed himself up, kicking and twisting, carving ruts in the sand with the outline of his suit. In seconds he had to stop, exhausted. He looked up. He had come maybe 2 meters. He still had another 7 or 10 to go. He looked down. The ants had massed in place. 2 were climbing atop others to try and reach him. Which they would, of course. About sand, ants were practically overqualified. Come on, don't just watch them. He strained and shoved himself up some more, feeling a prolonged shudder of claustrophobic panic when the narrowness stopped him suddenly. He couldn't move. It felt, even through the suit, which was insane, as though the entire weight, the entire crushing mass of Banshee held him. The planet had him, pinned at chest and back, waiting for the mood to strike and the cavern to shift. The suit would resist, crumpling more and more before the planet would grow bored and slam him flat like 2 palms. Would he feel it? What would he feel? His organs spewing through his mouth, perhaps? Damn you, Felix! And he flung himself up once more, either to pop loose or to jam irrevocably. One or the other. He felt something touch his foot. He jerked it up, looking down. An ant was just below. But it seemed to be jammed as well. Experimentally, he lowered his foot again. The ant strained its claws upward and grazed the sole of the boot. Nothing else. It couldn't reach him yet. Not yet. But it would. It would work its way free. And soon. He arched, bucked, warping his spine and dragging at the siliconite sheen. He thought he felt something give. He mustered his energies for one major push. The land, the cavern, the walls of the fissure, all shuddered with the sudden tremor. The walls closed in on him. Just a bit. They stopped, shaking. Then they closed in a bit more. And then some more. Then it stopped. The last movement, the last shifting, the last hope. If he hadn't been caught before, he was now. I'm dead, he thought, and rested his faceplate against the sand. He closed his eyes. Odd how he could hear nothing, even with the sunlight on him. Siliconite was a great tool, all right, like those concussion sellers. He sighed. I'm so tired, he thought. And then he thought, Kent, you worthless, timid, everybody's hero bastard. Oh, but why not? Come on. Sorry about that. Oh, but why not? Why the hell not? If it had been the other way around, he'd have done the very same thing. Except, of course, he wouldn't have, he realized with a mournful groan. He would have helped. That's what hurt. For Kent, Fleet's Kent, Forrest's Kent, he'd have hopped down that hole swinging. In a scout suit, no less. Never mind the awesome might of Kent's custom build. But why? Why? How had this happened? How had he folded so badly and so quickly? He glanced down. A second ant had joined the first. Not long now. He glanced at the time, shook his head, looked again. He had been alone almost half an hour. He was sure of it, because he remembered looking before when he had to stop and transfer the... What an insane idea. Quickly as a striking snake, his hand reached down and snatched the blaze bomb loose. He held it firmly pressed against his faceplate. Exhilarated sweat broke out. No way, he knew. No way, of course, he thought, grinning delightedly. Still, it was nice to kill a few. Yup, he said to the bomb. Killing them is better than getting peeled. In fact, killing them is better than not killing them. Killing them is fun. The narrow gap between the two beneath him would require a little delicacy. No good to have it get hung up on them. Plasteel was very nice, but 2 meters away from a blaze bomb, it was about as protective as cotton. Of course, it would unstick me. Maybe it didn't matter. Thus confined, even from so far away as the cavern floor, the bomb would almost certainly kill him. Either with the blaze or the compression or by shaking loose the pinning walls, driving them suddenly together to squash... What the hell, he said, keying and dropping the bomb in a single motion. It fell cleanly between the two monsters. Well, that was something anyway. The blaze killed the ants instantly. It also boiled their hides, fusing them into a single hurtling mass that rushed like an artillery shell up the fissure. Felix was aware of light, noise, and finally, movement. Then all was dark. Was he dead? It sure hurt. He opened his eyes. The light streaming through from above was a searing on his retinas. His eyelids fluttered. He tried moving, found he could do that. So he looked and moved together and found out where he was. The last part of the fissure just below the surface. He was hanging, sagging, down into the crevice, too wide to slip through and fall. But he had to have come that way. The ants were everywhere, plastered to the sides of the fissure, and, he noticed distastefully, to him. Mostly on his legs, but his back and hands and even his chest had ground ant packed on them. He was surrounded. He propped a boot against the curve of each wall and raised himself erect. He examined the exit, glaring brightly and painfully. Not too far. He glanced again at that last narrow section between his boots. It wasn't wide enough for his helmet. He shuddered, turned back into the light. Better not to think about it. It took him several tries to get a grip on the sides of the opening. The pain had steadily increased in almost every area, and his muscles had begun almost immediately to tremble and knot. Hurt bad, he thought dimly. Really, really bad. He began pulling himself up and knew at once he wouldn't make it. He was too weak. He was too tired. It hurt too much. He had no idea how much power was left in the suit. He couldn't read the dial. He tried marshalling a final effort. Nope. Falling. Colors flashed dizzily across his eyes, followed by rhythmic waves of feverish heat. Falling. Straight back, his grip going and lost down here. Armored hands on his upper limbs lifted him easily, miraculously, into the open air and sunlight. He squinted from side to side, vaguely recognizing the shapes of the warriors beside him. He nodded to them. He straightened up proudly. He crumpled, without warning, onto his heels. Alive. Even now. Even this. No pity. Felix! He recognized the voice. Forest? No. Shern. Canada. Her shadow blotted out the bright light as she leaned over him. Felix, you made it! You made it! We thought you were lost! Nathan thought you were lost! Oh, Felix! And she hugged him, awkwardly, painfully. He groaned and tried to pull away. But she wouldn't let go. She hugged him again. Oh, Felix! They should give you a medal, too! The second shadow before him was Kent. He saw it hanging on the front of the great blue chest armor. Even though it wasn't there, he saw it. It glinted in the sun. Perfect. Now was the time to pop his suit, he thought in a wave of scalding bitterness. And with that thought, the dark and the cold and the strength of both returned at last, slamming in from all sides at once, protecting and separating him once more. With a vengeance, the engine had returned. He slept. Shaking pain. Shaking and pain. He awoke only because he had to, and there was the psychotech, red-faced and shaking his shoulders and screaming, I'm so sorry! So sorry! Oh, God, I am! I am! Two meditechs dragged him away. He struggled with them to get back. You don't understand! He shouted at them. A doctor type bearing white-haired authority appeared. He tried to soothe him. You don't understand, the psychotech pleaded. It's my fault. Nonsense, son, purred the doctor. The ants did this to him. Felix smiled. No, no, no! It was me! A third meditech pressed something against his arm. Almost at once, the man began to calm. His shouting fell to unintelligible mutters. Soon he was slumped between the two meditechs. They hoisted him away. See to it that he's looked after, the doctor called to them. Yes, doctor, one of them called back. Felix realized he was still lying in his open suit. They must have just brought him up. White-gloved hands appeared overhead and fiddled around him. He couldn't see their owners. Maybe there weren't any. A second doctor type, older and female, appeared beside the first. The emblem over her left pocket was huge and colorful. Sorry, Chief, the doctor told her. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Chief, the doctor told her. Don't give it a thought, she replied soothingly. These things happen in war. Felix smiled again. The doctor turned to another woman, hurrying past. Leclerc, he called, what happened here? Leclerc was pretty. Not blonde, though. She shrugged her shoulders. That psychotech evidently worked with this man. He felt responsible for sending him down again and having this... Felix regarded the banks of flickering lights all around him. One of the magic gloves reappeared. It placed a clear nozzle into the suit beside his chin. It sucked and gurgled. Leclerc was still talking, screaming and shouting about how he'd already been through so much. Through too much. The sack? Asked the doctor. No, replied Leclerc. She pointed a clipboard at Felix. This guy, the scout, said he'd already had 4 major medicals and some ungodly number of... Hey, he's awake. 4 major medicals? Echoed the older woman, the chief. She looked at the doctor unhappily. How's that possible? It's not, the doctor assured her firmly. It's not. Then he leaned forward over Felix and became fatherly. Son, have you ever been in intensive medical before now? Do you recognize this room? Felix couldn't speak, but the engine could still smile. It did. It seemed to scare them. Good. He slept. It was perfect. He recognized the voices because he had gone to sleep hearing them. He recognized their problem the same way. It seemed a great deal of trouble to open his eyes, and since he could already enjoy their uneasiness without it, he didn't. He was a computer glitch, and it wasn't anybody's fault. Still, something had to be done. His group, his A-team, had been reported wiped out, so he, Felix, was too. Only he wasn't. His number was still in there somewhere in the other banks, and that's why they kept calling him, because they called everybody from those outfits that weren't there. Why take them out of the computer? But anyway, that's how it happened. It's a tragedy and unfair, but what are we going to do about it when they find out? It'll be our necks either way, you know it will, Chief. Chief agreed. Something had to be done. But what? The doctor wanted to know. Chief had an idea, and the doctor didn't like it, but how did he think the chief felt about it? It's just that their only chance was in the records themselves. No option. They decided to leave him with 12 drops instead of 20, 5 majors instead of 13, 1 major medical instead of 5. It was the only way. Felix heard it all. He pronounced it perfect. He became aware of days. Different meditechs came at different times, and then all again. One day he awoke to a solid ceiling instead of the clear curved dome of intensive medical. A meditech came to give him an explanation of his condition. There was a long list of injuries in it. Felix was enjoying watching the man's lips work, so elastic, when, suddenly, they stopped. "You're not even listening," accused the irritated man. "Don't you even care?" "Of course," replied Felix in a clear, strong engine voice. There was a commotion in the corridor outside of his room. He heard the name Kent and opened his eyes as the shaft of light crossed toward him. There he was, huge shoulders silhouetted. A meditech stood beside him. Something odd. They had stopped talking. They were staring at something beside him. The meditech ran off in a hurry. Felix rolled over on his side and saw the crumpled psychotech, blood still pulsing from his wrists. Felix rolled back onto his back and closed his eyes. He needed all his rest if he wanted to kill ants. He had to work out in secret, because the Physitech didn't understand and would make him stop. The Physitech had never dropped, and he didn't know the shame of a body that just kept failing. He visited his suit often. It was fine. In his new squad bay, they were always new, all the kids could talk about was the Masao being aboard. It was supposedly top secret, but everyone seemed to have found out about it the instant he had arrived. It was hard to hide an imperial yacht, of course. The ones who knew almost nothing about the Masao, either the planet or the man, enjoyed great status while telling about it to others who knew even less. Felix soon learned that this pattern was unavoidable. Everywhere he went, the squad bay, the mess, even the gym, the same thing was going on. Wide-eyed kids asking other wide-eyed kids if it was true what they said about the Masao. Did he really own the planet? That whole wealthy planet and all 15 million people? Was it true they practically worshipped him? He could change anything the regular government did, just like that? What's a samurai? Was that the same thing as being from Japan, and how come everybody on Masao practically was Japanese? Did everybody really have to call him Great One, even the captain? When they asked Felix about it, the way they asked him about everything else, he just shrugged, like always. The screen at the foot of the bunk finally gave in. It was time. "Good luck, Felix," said one of the kids. Felix smiled at him. Then he made himself get up and go over and pat him on his freckled shoulder and thank him for it. Only then would he let himself leave. He did, hurriedly, but feeling good about what he could do through the sheer power of his will. It was worse than a minor drop. It was a token drop. The Masao, they claimed, wanted to see Banshee for himself. Felix stood at the end of the line of 30 regulars listening to the briefing while awaiting the Imperial presence. The mission was officially a probe placement. Felix had heard all he was told before. He knew the purpose of the probe, to measure the shifting magnetic patterns of Banshee. He knew why it was important. Once man could learn how the ants were able to change the patterns artificially, they could program their missiles to adopt to it. Adapt, it should say, but it says adopt. He even knew the essential truth about the probes themselves. They didn't work. The sergeant doing the briefing ended it the same way as always.
Just stay the hell away from the damn things and let the techs do their work. Right? Right.
All heads turned at the appearance of the man at the entrance of the drop bay. He was an Imperial guard and an incredible sight. He wore bright red armor with the Masao's crest emblazoned across the chest in white. He wore a white silk scarf around his helmet where his forehead should be. He wore 2 swords, one short, one long. He was beautiful. He spoke in highly dramatic, thickly accented Standard.
Be all aware, His Royal Highness Alejandro Jorge Umemoto, Supreme Lord and Great One of...
Enough, Suki, said a strong and gentle voice. Just let me in. Suki sounded upset. He waved a hand abruptly at the entrance.
The Masao,
he said shortly. There were a few giggles in the ranks at Suki's expense. They stopped when he walked in. The Masao was wearing gold armor. Not that it wasn't plasteel, too. Not that it wasn't strong and utilitarian. It was. But it was also gold. The collective sigh was almost unanimous. Behind the Masao, in 2 sharply stepping files, entered the remainder of the Imperial Guard. There were 18 altogether. All wore the red, the scarves, the swords. One carried an extra 2, the Great Ones. The captain in charge of the mission immediately fell all over himself, trying to show not only the proper respect, but also that he wasn't really that undone by it all. What he succeeded in displaying was his almost paralyzing sense of intimidation. The Great One rescued him. Charming and friendly, making a great effort not to appear mighty, while making it clear to all that the effort was a genuine courtesy on his part, he did manage to calm them down a bit. He even insisted the captain merely call him Sir, a gesture which visibly shook his guards, even through their armor. Next he started down the line, shaking the hand of each and every warrior. Almost no one present was aware of the true purpose of the guard that accompanied him down the line, to kill anyone insufficiently safe, courteous, or impressed. He wasn't needed. All were awed. He didn't make it to Felix at the end of the line. The sudden appearance of the ship's captain himself stopped the greetings. A brief ceremony followed, with the skipper loudly and dramatically bestowing his prayers, faith, etc. on the Great One's journey. The Masao handled it all as if he had been accepting even greater honors all his life, which he had. Then it was time to go. The scouts were called to point. Felix was with them. He stepped out of the ranks and took his place in front. The non-combatants fled the chamber. Felix found that he was trembling. But that ended when the familiar pattern of transit lights began. He tensed forward eagerly. He was ready for this. He was ready for nothing else. Then the lights went to green, and he stepped forward. It would be his 21st drop. And his last. Fleet seemed to be getting the hang of it. They had said no ants, and there were none about. Felix approved of the glimmer of professionalism, though personally, of course, he was disappointed. He scanned the area. No wind now, but evidence of a recent storm was everywhere. There were no mazes. And what few dunes did exist were smooth, sloping things rising and falling with gradual grace. The landscape rose gently eastward in broad, widely spaced humpbacks. In all other directions, vision was unobstructed for several kilometers. It was a good team. The warriors spread out without having to be told, forming the defensive perimeter. The Imperial Guard was even better. Their circle around the Masao was completed many seconds sooner. Felix found himself in the center of both rings along with the CO, the Tex, and the Masao. He couldn't stand it. He offered to scout up slope while the first probe was being planted. "Of course," replied the CO, as if he'd ordered instead of approved. He went almost 2 kilometers. Nothing. No enemy, no ants. "Shit," he mumbled and trotted back down slope. He was perhaps half a kilometer away from the rest of the team, they had just come into view below him, when he stopped short. He didn't want to go back. He turned around and looked back up the hill. That was where the ants were. Sooner or later. He looked back down slope. There was... what? Probes. A safe route, a quick route, then home. No ants. Just worthless readings and the Masao. He didn't want to go back. And he wasn't. He was actually turning away toward Banshee and ants and oblivion when the sudden bright glare off the gold caught his eye. He squinted. Then, seeing it, he gasped. His mouth went dry. The Masao was coming up the slope. There was another with him in a red suit. Suki, no doubt. Felix began to shake. The urge to flee was immensely strong. Anything. Anything. But not this. Yet he stood still where he was. Even when, at 50 meters, Suki stopped to let the Masao approach alone. Even then, knowing what it must mean. Even then, he could not move. The Masao halted a mere 2 steps away. And during the brief silence before he spoke, Felix could feel the engine shudder. Then, "Hello, Felix." He sighed. "Hello, Allie." Allie stepped forward to join in the embrace. Felix stopped him short by thrusting his hand forward. Allie paused, looked at the black armored hand offered him, then slowly took it in his own. Felix shook briefly, then dropped his hand. He had to moisten his lips before he could speak. "Didn't waste much time, did you?" "That's if you don't count the 2 years it took to find you," Allie replied with a laugh. He gestured about him. "Besides, I don't much like this place." "Who else knows?" "About you? No one but me." "And you won't tell 'em?" Felix sniffed sarcastically. Allie's reply was soft with gentle hurt. "I wouldn't do that, Felix. You should know that." "All right. What are you doing here?" "I came to get you." "And take me back to Golden?" "Yes, Golden." There was a pause. Felix stared at the sand. "Felix, what are you doing in this place?" "Killing ants." "I see," Allie replied slowly. He took a frustrated step to one side, then back. "Yes, I had heard that. You're good at it?" "I am." Allie strode forward and peered at him. "So tell me, old friend, does it help?" "Don't, Allie," Felix warned and took a step back. "I don't think it does." "Allie." "You couldn't even say Golden just now." "Stop it." "So I don't believe you dare think the rest of it." "Stop!" "Or of her." And Felix hit him. It was not a deadly blow. It was not even hard. This was Allie, after all. But Suki came running anyway, drawing his long sword. The blade glowed with the rich dullness of plasteel. Felix shoved Allie back and eagerly faced the charging guard. "Who's the clown?" he called as belligerently as he could. Allie threw up a golden arm. "Suki, hold!" The guard skidded to a halt. "But my lord!" "I am unhurt," assured his master calmly. "Leave us." "You tell him, Allie!" snarled Felix, spoiling. Suki whirled to face him again. "You dare to speak that way?" Felix pointed a blunt black finger. "You won't believe how quickly I'll kill you," he said flatly. Suki raised the sword. "Hold, Suki," commanded Ali. "Put that away." Suki stared helplessly at him. He obeyed reluctantly. "Lord, how can you let him behave so?" Ali patted his armored shoulder. "Suki, a guardian Archon behaves as he will." "Don't call me that!" Felix snapped angrily. "It is what you are," replied Ali firmly. Suki had dropped to his knees before Felix. "My lord Archon, please forgive me. I didn't know." Felix stared at him. "Ah, shit. Just go away." Suki did not move. "I said go." "You know he can't do that now, Felix." Felix groaned. Ali was right. He did know that. "You can do it, though. You tell him, Ali." "And shame him further." "Damn you, Ali!" he snapped. He hesitated, then stood over the kneeling samurai. He looked at Ali. "I don't remember what to say." "Oh, come now, Felix!" Ali snorted disgustedly. "I don't!" insisted Felix. Ali peered at him. "Truly?" Felix shook his head. "I don't remember." "Rise, loyal one, forgiven," Ali intoned. Felix repeated it. Suki stood, bowed, and backed away without a sound. Felix watched him go. He turned back to his friend. "Ali, you set that up. You set me up." "Yes, I needed to know." "Well, you found out." "Yes, you buried it deep." "Let it stay there, Ali." "No." The ominous tone touched Felix. He felt something tearing far inside. The engine warped violently in and out of the shadows. "Ali, please. Look at you. Look at what you've become. Wrapped up in that husk of yours. You look like a weapon." "That's what I am, Ali." "Yes, but whose?" "My own." "That's not the way it works, Felix." He raised his gold-covered hands and clenched them into fists before Felix's faceplate. "God damn you, Felix!" he roared. "You are not dead! Stop acting like it!" Felix lurched back as if struck. He knew it was coming. He saw it in his friend's angry eyes. And he knew there was no way to stop it. There was no protection, no armor. Not for this. "Angel is dead," said the Masao. Felix sank to his knees like a rag doll. "No, Ali." "She's dead. Angel died." "No, please." He was gasping, his arms folded tightly across his stomach. He couldn't breathe. "She's dead. Your wife is dead. She died in a freighter accident." He vomited, tried to crawl away. The Masao followed. "It was a freak accident. It shouldn't have happened, but it did." "Please, no!" Felix gasped. "Yes, yes, you know it. You found the freighter yourself." "Ali!" "No! You found the ship and you found her body, or what was left of it after zero pressure had blown." "No!" He rose back to his knees. His arms shot out from his sides, begging, beseeching. "No, no, no! Angel! Angel!" And he screamed the scream again, that same scream from that same horrible ice-bloody sight. He screamed with his mind, and he screamed with his soul, and he could not stop, not to breathe, not to forget, not to live. He fainted the only way. When he awoke, he was lost. He tried to rise, but something held him fast. Something strong and gold. Ali! and it all rushed back in waves of pulsing agony, and he wept as only once before he had. The golden arms curled around him, holding him, as his body jerked and heaved with each racking sob. He clung to Allie, trying to make it. And it helped. Even through the armor, it helped. But he couldn't do it. He reached for the forearm panel to pop the suits. Allie's powerful arms, possessing all the leverage, clamped his arms too tightly. He struggled, but could not get them free. "Oh, Allie, I want to die!" "Is that all?" asked his friend gently. "Just die?" "That's all." "And so you came here?"
"I guess so."
"But you forgot you can't just die."
"Why can't I?"
Allie held him tighter, cradling. "Because, despite it all, you are Felix and must be killed." Again he slept. When next he awoke, the sobs were much less devastating. His body could no longer support them, perhaps. Soon they stopped. He lifted his helmet from Allie's golden lap and sat up. Several meters away, the warriors and guard were gathered into small groups, sitting and talking. And, obviously, waiting. "I'm sorry," said Felix. "How long was I out?" "Don't worry about it," Allie said gently. "You feel better?" "Yes. I can't believe I could just sleep. I just got up." He indicated the others. "Haven't they said anything?" "Forget them." "But the drop—" "Forget that too." "But—" He stopped, seeing it. He faced his friend. "It was all a fake. The drop, all for me." Allie nodded slowly. "Mostly," he admitted. "This is Banshee, however, and we are carrying probes. Of course, they don't work. They never have. So I understand. Lovely war, this. How'd you do it? You said no one else knew." "And they don't. No one here, except Suki, knows." "Then how, Allie?" Allie shrugged. "The Master of the Terra was most cooperative. He gave me a drop of my own." "He went along without even knowing why?" "I am the Masao." Felix smiled. For some reason, he had always found his friend's astonishing arrogance endearing. He gestured toward the others. "And the CO?" "Oh, much easier. Command voice and all that." Felix winced. "He's not a pet, Allie." "Oh, really? Then what's he doing here?" He laughed, started to say something else. But it came again, without warning, doubling him over, grinding up and out. He wept and wept. He had been sitting and staring at nothing, thinking of nothing. He was numb, exhausted, wrenched flat. And, he realized with amazement, relieved. He didn't know exactly what it meant. He didn't want to know. Or at least he didn't feel like examining it. Beside him, sitting patiently and waiting, with his back to it all, sat the Masao. Felix smiled. He had his legs G-crossed, Buddha fashion. All his life he had known this man. He was closer to him than any other human. Despite the fact that they were from two different planets and two different cultures, they had managed to stay in touch since infancy. Most of the major events in their lives had been joint ventures. Allie had been best man. But what really, he thought, did they have in common? Only that their recent ancestors had been rich enough and tough enough and egocentric enough to establish favorite monarchies on the two richest planets in known space. Even in that respect, the two were different. Felix had been but one of 12 candidates for guardian. The Masao had been the Masao from conception. He had always known it, and always loved it that way. Whereas Felix... Still, he loved him. In his short life, there had been only the two who had touched him. Now, one. He glanced at the time. Damn, 2 hours here. Allie, we've got to get out of here. Call the ship. Suddenly you're in a hurry. I'm not. The ants are. They must have sensed us by now. They'll be coming. Fleet reports no ants here. It's why I picked it. Felix stared at him. Fleet reports? I thought you'd been keeping track of this war. I see what you mean. Fleet isn't here. Felix laid a glove on his shoulder. Let me tell you something, old friend. Fleet is never here. Call the ship. I can't. Well, I could, of course, but we need to go somewhere else to get picked up. Why is that? Damn it, Felix. This is supposedly a probe placement. They pick us up at the end of the line when we've finished planting them. Where? About 10 kilometers, I believe. When? The Masao eyed him with distaste. I think I liked you better in my lap. When, Allie? About 5 hours. Plenty of time. Felix stood up. Let's get started. You trying to scare the Masao? Allie, don't you understand? This is Banshee. Oh, you mean this is Banshee? Felix tried to get angry. He failed. Come on, he urged. Relax, my friend. We'll have you in the Hall of Gold in less than... No. Allie paused. He stood up. You mean you won't go back? Let's talk about it later. We've got to get these people moving. Very well, Allie agreed reluctantly. For now. Suki? They were up and moving in seconds, a steady procession of 2 concentric circles. A good team. Felix only had one suggestion. He thought that the probes ought to be left behind now that their purpose had been served. The CO treated the advice like an order. Yes, sir, he replied respectfully and ordered the probes abandoned on the spot. Felix stared at him. Now that he noticed it, all the others were treating him with equal deference. He caught them glancing his way occasionally, always taking care not to get caught gawking. He accused the Masao. Allie laughed. I swear to you, I told no one, and Suki wouldn't dare. Well, I guess seeing that we knew each other. Allie laughed again. Could be that. Could be your command voice. Buzz off, Allie. You can't still blame them, Allie insisted. Besides, it wasn't their fault the freighter buckled. Felix sighed. It was their fault she was on the freighter in the first place. They had been walking for over an hour. Allie had been on him the whole way. He turned his gaze to the others, marching steadily around them. No one had approached, no one had spoken. Their privacy was respected. Pure Masao, he thought wryly. He realized Allie had been talking. What? He asked. His friend sounded exasperated. I said you can't go on blaming the whole people. I said you can't go on blaming a whole people for a mistake made by a few. Allie, those few didn't just err, they defaulted. You know how long it took me to run away? 3 months. I planned for 3 months and my bodyguard still almost caught up with me. Angel lost hers without planning in 3 minutes. That's a breakdown in commitment. The guards simply didn't care enough about her to do their duty. All right, Allie conceded. Perhaps you're right. No perhaps about it. Okay, you made your point. But you're still blaming the planet for it? Allie, the guards were just indicative. They never accepted Angel. No one ever did. They never gave her a chance. Allie shrugged. She was an Earth woman. Your people resented it. God damn it, my mother was from Earth. So was yours. They never had any trouble. That was a long time ago, partner. They were there from the start. They were very old and revered. Mine still is. He grinned, looked sideways at his friend. Still beautiful, too? Allie laughed. By imperial decree. I always loved your mother. She loved you. She missed you. She's missed you. Yes. They were quiet for several steps. Angel left me a note before she left. Did I tell you that? Unless that's Felix talking. Oh, it was Felix. Angel left me a note before she left. Did I tell you that? Yes. She said she was afraid she was holding me back. Yes. She didn't know. Even then, she still didn't know how much I... His voice cracked. He fought the churning. Do you want to stop? Allie asked him. No. We can. We've got plenty of time. No, he said firmly. I'll be all right. He looked at Allie through his tears. Maybe I will, he thought. An hour later they had covered over half the distance. The landscape had gradually changed. They were on a long broken plain apparently unaffected by the storm. Crusted dunes were everywhere around them. In the distance, foothill-sized drifts could be made out. Allie tried patriotism. The people need you, he said. Felix sighed. They have a guardian now. They have Tasp. You know about that? Well, you have bothered to keep up then. No, but who else could it have been? You. Well, it wasn't. You would be better. What's wrong with Tasp? Don't the people like him? Of course they do. He's a good guardian. Well then. But he isn't you. Allie stopped suddenly, looked at him carefully. They wanted you. Felix matched his gaze. I wanted Angel. Another hour. The team sat or lay sprawled around them in the sand. They were making very good time. Allie voiced concern about arriving early. If we have to wait 2 hours there, won't it be just as bad? If we have to wait 2 hours there, won't it be just as bad? Ha ha! Laughed Felix. I have scared the Maso. Don't be impertinent. Felix laughed again. Yes, great one. And he went on to explain that it was location, not timing, that counted. He was explaining about the 3-hour safety margin surrounding retrieval when it hit him. He stopped and stared at his friend, seeing him, really seeing him for the first time. And, more importantly, really believing he was there. He sat forward and threw his arms around his chest and held him close. They were silent for several seconds. Then they broke away. Allie peered closely into his faceplate. You're back, he said. Felix smiled. Yes. This is really you again. Felix laughed. It always was. Some of you, Allie corrected. He nodded. Some of me still, Allie. It's been very bad. Whatever. I think it's incredible. In 4 hours, after 2 years of being whoever it was you were. Felix shrugged. I was already on my way. He was dying. He? The engine. And that is what? Exactly. A what, as opposed to a who. Allie shook his head. I don't get it. Good. It's just something that, well, it kept me alive. If that's what you call living, the life you had is, Allie, once and for all, I'm not going back. Never. The Maso sighed loudly. He lay back in the sand. All right. He tapped the toe of a boot against Felix's armor. I hope your next suit is more fun. Felix shook his head violently. No, no more armor for me. I don't... He stared at something in the distance, not seeing it, and wondered how he had possibly done it at all. He shook the thoughts away. I don't know what I'd do if I had to fight again. No more armor for me. Allie shrugged. I wasn't talking about fighting especially, but it's still armor, whether you admit it or not. It's still something you hide in. He sat up. Felix, you came here to hide in there, but everything you were hiding from was in there with you. That's the trouble with armor. It won't protect you from what you are. And what is that?
what you'll do. When it counts. Suki approached and bowed. Speak, said the Maso, standing up.
Lord, the officer in charge reports the scout. He looked at Felix, embarrassed. That is one of the warriors. He was sent ahead over the next hill. He reported retrieval proximity.
Hot damn, said Allie happily, slapping his golden palms. We're there. Damn near, Felix agreed.
Lord, then I can tell them we can begin at once?
Oh, yes. Yes, Suki, by all means. At once. Let's get the hell out of here.
Yes, Lord.
Suki agreed happily, bowing and backing away. Felix stood up too. Soon the procession was again on the move. They marched in silence over the hill. Soon each had the retrieval beacon flickering below his holos. Only a few hundred yards to go. Allie matched steps with him, throwing an arm over his shoulders. So tell me, what are you gonna do? How are you going to live? Felix grinned. The Maso will be pleased to provide the necessary luxuries. Allie's arm jerked away as if stung. And what if he does not? He demanded in mock outrage. Felix's grin broadened. Then I'll break his legs. Humph, sniffed the Maso. Said Felix the scout. Felix laughed. Of course, there is always blackmail. Blackmail? You dare to suggest the record of the Great One is impure? Personally, I would not, replied Felix humbly, but Labella might. Labella? Now there's someone your mother would really love. How could you do this to your oldest and dearest friend? You bastard! I was only 16. That's the best part, seeing as how she was 60-something. She was not. She was 30-ish. Felix threw back his head and cackled. Are you kidding? Her wrinkles had wrinkles. You could draw a line between her nipples and her navel. That's unfair. Unlikely is what it was. You're very cruel. Labella loved me. Felix shrugged. You were a big tipper. Now that is unfair. I always thought so, considering the quality of her act. Felix, don't you start on her dancing again. You just never understood. She was a very artistic grandmother. Allie started to speak, but the laughter burst through at last. They howled a while. Then Allie became quiet. You know, I think about Labella now and again. I should think so. You were going to give up your title for her. Allie sighed elaborately. Ah, I did love her. I had such passion for her eyes. That's horniness. For her you have no romance in you, you know that? Felix laughed. My karma. Your karma's jammed, said Allie sourly. Felix laughed again. Now, to the money? Oh, very well, even though it's against my principles, but only in installments. I don't want you running off on me again. Felix touched an armored hand gently to the other's arm. I won't. Never again. Allie looked at him. His eyes shone. I know, he said shortly. Then, I brought you a ship. It's small, but... You knew? Cried Felix, amazed and delighted. The Maso nodded. Let's say I feared. Felix stopped, put an arm out to stop Allie. Then he placed his faceplate against his. Thank you, Allie, for... The tears ran warmly down his smile. For coming to get me. Allie blinked, embarrassed. He shrugged elaborately. I had some free time. Felix laughed. And it began. So quickly it began. The wind first. It swept over them without warning, pounding against them with rhythmic, pulsing gusts. The sand sizzled against their armor. The transit cone symbol appeared on his and everyone else's holos. The CO's voice barked on command frequency. Everyone in from the perimeter. Prepare for retrieval. The Imperial Guard materialized out of a gust, collapsing around their master. Damn this wind! Shouted Allie. Come on!
he shouted and started to run. Felix and the guard followed. The CO again. Transit cone sighted. Everyone in on me. On the double. Felix and Allie arrived at the back of a... Oh gosh, there's rhymery. Felix and Allie arrived at the back of a pack of warriors. Seeing them, the warriors parted to let them by. The transit cone, 10 meters away, shimmered clearly before them. The CO again, in front of them as a gust receded. Sir, if you'd care to go first. I would indeed, replied Allie, stepping forward and motioning Felix to do the same. What's that? Asked a voice. Felix was not paying attention. Looks like a mountain, said another voice. Felix was just following Allie. Where? Asked a third voice. Felix automatically looked around. There, said the first voice. And Felix looked where the man was pointing and froze. The warrior was pointing to a hive. It was the biggest Felix had ever seen. Kilometers away, it must have been thousands of meters high. But he did not think of that then. He thought of hive, knuckle, transit beam, the hammer! The hammer! Allie! The first blast was awesome. It threw him off his feet. He crashed into the sand on his side. He could see nothing for the sand. Screams piercing, whimpering, unbelieving, filled his ears. He couldn't find Allie, and he yelled for him, but there were too many people yelling already, and too many forms on the hollows. He stood up and rushed forward, and the second hammer struck, flattening him face down into the sand. And there were more screams, and with them horrible sounds coming from all over of wrenching plasteel and bone and pressure escaping. Allie! He screamed, but he could hardly hear his own voice, much less any reply. Another blast erupted, and another, and another. All around him. Homing in, he knew. Homing in on the transit beacon and the people and Allie and... More screams, and something flew past him, crumpling as it went, and he knew what it must be, but he didn't care. He didn't! It wasn't gold. And there he was, suddenly, on the ground before him, the cone flickering dully off the gold. He rushed forward and grabbed and tried to lift as another blast struck, and more screams. No! Allie was screaming. Let go! And he saw it then, saw the hole, saw the sand being blown out from between Allie's golden clenched fingers as they tried to hold it shut. Seconds, only seconds left. Allie, I'll carry you, don't worry. He reached down and tried to get a hold to lift the huge suit, but it was an awkward position, and he was so afraid of dislodging Allie's grip on the hole. The hole! My God, a hole! Seconds! Seconds! I've got you! He said, and the next blast struck. Damned close. And in that instant, before he careened away, he saw, through the glare of the blast, through the blinding sand, through the reflection of it all on Allie's faceplate, the fear. Allie was afraid. And then he was crashing and tumbling through the air, and the sand and the bodies jounced obscenely past him and against him, and the world was filled with the sounds of their terrors and their deaths. Seconds, seconds, seconds. Somehow he was back and leaning over him again. There was nothing else, nothing but this to do, and this one to live, to make it, to live. Allie! But the glove on the rip was weakened and opening, the head lolling inside the helmet. No! He screamed. No! And he reached down and clamped his glove over his friend's and gripped with all his might. With his other hand he reached around and down and lifted him, weightless, up against him as a mother does her child, pressed against her chest and fuck. With his other hand he reached around and down and lifted him, weightless, up against him as a mother does her child, pressed against her chest and protecting. Allie's faceplate full on his own. Allie's eyes darted slowly and rested on his, and he opened his mouth, and ice formed immediately on his gums, but he still managed to say, "Felix," before he died. 3 steps into the cone, unhurt by the carnage, untouched by it. Transit. The patterned lights. The drop bay and people everywhere rushing with waving arms and strident voices. Someone tried to take the golden suit from his arms, and for a moment the urge to kill was strong and clear and pure. But no. He relented, slid the shining gold to the floor, and walked away. It may as well have been an empty suit. Allie was gone. People pushed against him, shoving him back from the growing center of alarm and accusations. He moved when they pushed, stood still where they left him. He seemed to be there a long time, facing without seeing the cascade of movement and emotion. Then someone took him by the arm and led him firmly away. Someone big, in big blue armor. Fine. He could walk. He could do that. Through the corridors they went. They passed the door to the armor locker. They took a lift. They transferred to another. They began to walk faster, urged by the big blue glove on his arm. They were in a part of the ship he had never seen. He recognized it from the briefings and the rest, but he couldn't seem to place it exactly. And he was tired of walking, tired of the suit, tired of the urgency he could not match in their strides. They stopped. The blue arm let go. He stood in semi-darkness, watching as a black and white jumpsuit, security, rushed forward yelling about unauthorized and wearing armor where they should not, and the blue arm whipped out tendon taut, and the black and white was on the floor. What the hell? He blinked and looked, and Kent? Kent? Kent was coming toward him again, the determined iron look on his face. He had seen that look before, once before, and "No!" he blurted, and tried to push out to protect himself. But then the great blue fist rocketed up at his eyes, slamming against the faceplate, and as he fell, he relaxed and let go. At last, at least, it was over. And that is the end of our segment for today, the penultimate installment of Armor by John Steakley, and boy, howdy, was that a roller coaster. So yeah, next Monday, we will be finishing the book. We get to find out what's going on with Jack Crow and Co. We'll get to find out what happened with Felix. We'll get to find out a lot of things. Yes, this book is more or less a emotional and physical torture porn novel for Felix. It is not a good time for him. He does not have a good time. it's not nice. It is not very kind. Anyway, it's wild. It's just great. I gotta go. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. Hope you enjoyed. The rest of this week, I will be doing. Actually, I think I'm doing the final few stories in Voices from the Radium Age. There's 2 or 3 left, I think, including one by W.E.B. Du Bois and Neil R. Jones from the early 1900s. And then we will be doing more 3-Body Problem on Friday. Thanks again to everyone who tuned in. Have a good one. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. I gotta scoot. Toodles, until next time.